Millbrook Village, whispers cut deeper than winter wind. But sometimes the heart that society rejects finds its home in the most unexpected arms. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Millbrook, like secrets refusing to be revealed. Adelaide Whitmore pressed her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped through the village square, each footfall echoing against the stone buildings that had witnessed her humiliation just 3 days prior. The memory burned fresh in her mind, standing before the entire congregation while Reverend Fletcher's voice boomed through the chapel, declaring her engagement to Harold Blackwood null and void. The wooden sign of the baker's shop creaked in the autumn breeze, and Adelaide could feel the weight of curious stares through every window she passed. Mrs. Pemberton's lace curtains twitched as she walked by the milliner's shop, and young Tommy Fletcher stopped his game of marbles to watch her with the same mixture of pity and fascination that had followed her for days. Adelaide had once been the pride of Millbrook. Her father, Charles Whitmore, had owned the largest grain mill for 3 counties, and her engagement to Harold Blackwood, son of the local magistrate, had been celebrated as the union of 2 of the village's finest families. She had walked these same streets with her head held high, her silk gowns rustling against the cobblestones, her future as secure as the stone foundations of her father's mill. But fate, Adelaide had learned, could turn as quickly as the great wooden wheel that once powered her family's livelihood. The devastating fire that consumed the mill had taken more than just timber and stone. It had reduced her family's fortune to ash and ember. Her father's debts, hidden for months behind a facade of prosperity, had emerged like vultures after the flames died down. The Blackwood family, once eager to unite their name with the Whitmores, had withdrawn their blessing for the marriage with a swiftness that left Adelaide reeling. Harold himself had not possessed the courage to face her. Instead, he had sent word through his father's solicitor that their engagement could no longer stand, given the changed circumstances of her situation. The phrase echoed in Adelaide's mind with each step she took, changed circumstances, as if love itself could be measured in pounds sterling and property deeds. The worst humiliation had come during Sunday service, when Reverend Fletcher announced before the entire congregation that the bans for Adelaide Whitmore and Harold Blackwood were to be withdrawn. The silence that followed had been deafening, broken only by the rustle of prayer books and barely concealed whispers that would follow her for weeks to come. Adelaide pulled her shawl closer as she approached the general store, knowing she would need to face Mrs. Hartwell's pointed questions about her reduced circumstances. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the familiar scent of dried herbs and freshly ground coffee filled her nostrils. "Adelaide, dear," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "How are you managing? Such a difficult time for your family." "Well enough, thank you," Adelaide replied, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt in her hands. "I suppose you'll be looking for work soon," Mrs. Hartwell continued, arranging ribbon on the counter with unnecessary attention. "Though I can't imagine what skills a young woman of your former station might possess for honest labor." The words stung, but Adelaide had grown accustomed to such barbs. She had indeed been sheltered from practical aspects of life, educated in French and piano rather than cooking and household management. Her accomplishments, once prized in drawing rooms, seemed worthless in the harsh light of her new reality. "I'm certain something suitable will present itself," Adelaide said, purchasing the small amount of flour and sugar she could afford. As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward conspiratorially. "I heard tell that the Ashfords are looking for a governess. Of course, they're seeking someone with impeccable references and a spotless reputation." The implication hung thick in the air. "There's also talk that Farmer Brennan up at Oakwood Farm might be in need of help with his household. Though I dare say that would be quite a step down for someone who once expected to live in the magistrate's grand house." The mention of Oakwood Farm stirred something unexpected in Adelaide's chest. She had heard whispers about Ezra Brennan, the solitary farmer who worked the land just beyond the village boundaries. He had arrived in Millbrook several seasons ago, purchasing the abandoned Oakwood property and transforming it into one of the most productive farms in the county. Unlike other farmers who came to market with their families, Ezra Brennan always came alone, conducting his business with quiet efficiency before disappearing back to his isolated homestead. Walking slowly toward the small cottage that now served as her family's residence, Adelaide passed the village well where she had often played as a child with Harold and other children of prominent families. Now those same children, grown into adults, crossed to the other side of the street when they saw her approaching, as if her misfortune might be contagious. The cottage came into view, its thatched roof and modest garden a stark reminder of how far her family had fallen. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, spent most days in bed, overcome by shame of their reduced circumstances. Her father wandered the small rooms like a ghost, unable to reconcile himself to life without the constant hum of the mill wheel. Inside the cottage, her mother's voice drifted from the bedroom, weak and querulous. "Adelaide, is that you, dear?" "Yes, mother," Adelaide called back, setting her purchases on the rough wooden table. She found her mother propped against pillows, her once elegant features drawn and pale. "Did you see anyone at the market? Perhaps word from the Blackwoods? Surely Harold will come to his senses." Adelaide's heart ached for her mother's delusions. "No word, mother, but I heard mention of possible employment opportunities." Her mother's face fell. "Employment? Oh, Adelaide, surely it won't come to that. Your father is certain to find investors for rebuilding the mill." But Adelaide knew better. She had seen the papers, heard the conversations between her parents when they thought she was sleeping. The debts were too substantial, the loss too complete. The mill's location had been sold to satisfy creditors, and the Whitmore name, once synonymous with prosperity, was now whispered with pity. As evening approached and Adelaide prepared their modest supper, she found herself thinking again of Mrs. Hartwell's mention of Oakwood Farm. She had seen Ezra Brennan from a distance during walks along country lanes that bordered his property. He was a tall man with broad shoulders and hands that spoke of honest labor, his dark hair often tousled by wind that swept across his fields. There was something about his solitary figure that intrigued her, a man who seemed content with his own company, who had built something substantial from abandoned land. The cottage grew quiet as her parents retired early, exhaustion and despair driving them to seek refuge in sleep. Adelaide sat by the small window, watching stars emerge over Millbrook, and wondered what tomorrow might bring. The weight of shame that had pressed upon her shoulders for days seemed to shift slightly, replaced by something she had almost forgotten, the faint stirring of hope. Perhaps it was time to stop waiting for her old life to return and begin building something new from the ashes of her former existence. Perhaps it was time to discover what lay beyond the boundaries of her fallen expectations, in places where her name carried no history of disgrace. The wind rustled through the apple tree outside her window, and Adelaide closed her eyes, imagining the vast fields of Oakwood Farm stretching under the autumn moon, and the solitary figure of the farmer who had somehow managed to create prosperity from nothing but determination and honest work. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of the cottage as Adelaide rose before dawn. Her decision crystallized like frost on the window pane. She had spent the night in restless contemplation, and by the time the rooster's crow echoed across Millbrook, she knew what she must do. The whispered gossip, the pitying glances, the suffocating weight of her family's shame, all of it had become unbearable. She dressed carefully in her most practical gown, a dark blue woolen dress that had once been relegated to household tasks, but now represented her finest attire. Her hands trembled slightly as she braided her auburn hair and pinned it securely beneath a modest bonnet. The woman who looked back at her from the small mirror bore little resemblance to the pampered young lady who had once spent hours perfecting her appearance for social calls. In the kitchen, she prepared a simple breakfast for her parents and left it covered on the table with a note explaining her intentions. She could not bear to wake them and face her mother's protests or her father's defeated acceptance. The note was brief. She would seek employment at Oakwood Farm and would return before evening with news. The cottage door closed behind her with a soft click that seemed to echo with finality. Adelaide had walked the streets of Millbrook countless times, but never with such purpose, never with such awareness that each step might be carrying her toward a future she could not yet imagine. As she reached the edge of Millbrook, the road stretched before her like a brown ribbon, unfurling across the countryside. The path to Oakwood Farm was one she had travelled before, but always in her father's carriage or as part of social expeditions. Now, walking alone with nothing but determination in her heart, the journey felt transformed into something resembling a pilgrimage. The hedgerows that bordered the road were alive with autumn's final flourish, hawthorn berries glowing like rubies, blackberry vines heavy with fruit, and oak leaves turning the colour of burnt amber. Adelaide found herself noticing details that had escaped her attention during previous, more comfortable travels. The way morning dew collected in spiderwebs, transforming them into intricate jewelry, the sound of her footsteps creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of her heart. She passed Thornfield Cottage, where old Mrs. Abernathy kept bees and sold honey at the village market. The elderly woman was tending to her garden, and she looked up with surprise as Adelaide walked by. For a moment their eyes met, and Adelaide braced herself for another encounter filled with pity. Instead, Mrs. Abernathy simply nodded respectfully and returned to her work, a small kindness that Adelaide treasured more than the woman could know. The road began to climb gradually as it left the valley where Millbrook nestled, winding through countryside that grew wilder and more beautiful with each step. Stone walls built by generations of farmers marked property boundaries, and ancient elm trees provided patches of shade where Adelaide paused to rest and gather her courage. As she crested a small hill, Oakwood Farm spread before her like a vision from a pastoral painting. The property was vast, with fields that stretched toward the horizon in neat, well-tended rows. The farmhouse itself was built of local stone, its walls weathered to a warm grey that seemed to belong to the landscape as naturally as the trees from which the farm took its name. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Adelaide could see cattle grazing in distant pastures. Unlike the grand estates she had visited during her former life, Oakwood Farm possessed a different kind of beauty, one born of honest labor and practical necessity rather than ornamental display. The buildings were solid and well-maintained, the fences straight and strong, the gardens clearly designed for production rather than mere appearance. Her heart began to beat faster as she approached the main gate, suddenly aware of how presumptuous her mission might appear. She had no appointment, no formal introduction, only Mrs. Hartwell's casual mention that the farmer might need household help. What if Ezra Brennan turned her away? What if he had heard the gossip about her family's disgrace? The gate opened without protest, leading to a gravelled path that curved toward the main house. Adelaide could hear the sounds of farm life surrounding her, the gentle lowing of cattle, the rhythmic thud of an axe splitting wood, the musical clucking of chickens scratching in the barnyard. These were sounds she had heard before only as distant background music. Now they seemed to welcome her with their honest, unpretentious symphony. As she rounded the final curve in the path, she saw him. Ezra Brennan stood near the barn, talking quietly to a magnificent chestnut horse while he checked its harness. He was taller than Adelaide had realized during her distant glimpses, with broad shoulders that spoke of years spent in physical labor. His hair was dark with touches of early silver at the temples, and his hands moved with the gentle confidence of a man who understood animals and earned their trust. He looked up as her footsteps crunched on the gravel, and Adelaide felt her breath catch in her throat. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, grey-blue and penetrating but not unkind. There was something in his gaze that she had not encountered in weeks of sympathetic looks and pitying glances, a directness that seemed to see her as she was, rather than as the object of village gossip she had become. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and his voice carried the gentle authority of a man accustomed to being heard without raising his tone. "This is unexpected." Adelaide was surprised that he knew her name, though she supposed even an isolated farmer would have heard something of the Whitmore family's downfall. She managed a small curtsy, suddenly aware of how out of place her village manners might seem in this rural setting. "Mr. Brennan," she replied, striving to keep her voice steady, "I hope you'll forgive my unannounced visit. I was told you might have need of household assistance." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. The horse beside him nickered softly, and he laid a calming hand on its neck while continuing to regard Adelaide with those penetrating grey eyes. "Household assistance," he repeated slowly, and Adelaide detected no mockery in his tone, though she knew how improbable her offer must sound. "I know it may seem unusual," Adelaide said, lifting her chin in a gesture that recalled her former confidence. "But my circumstances have changed, and I find myself in need of honest employment. I may not have experience in all domestic arts, but I am willing to learn, and I give you my word that I would apply myself diligently to any tasks you might require." Ezra Brennan continued to study her, and Adelaide found herself noticing details she had missed during her distant observations. There were lines around his eyes that spoke of long hours working in bright sunlight, and his hands, though gentle with the horse, bore the calluses and small scars that came from years of farm work. "Walk with me," he said finally, leading the horse toward the barn. "Tell me about these changed circumstances." As they walked, Adelaide found herself speaking more freely than she had in weeks. Perhaps it was the peaceful atmosphere of the farm, or perhaps it was the way Ezra Brennan listened, with attention but without the eager curiosity that had characterized her interactions with the villagers. She told him about the fire, about the debts, about the broken engagement and the public humiliation that had followed. They had reached the barn, where the sweet scent of hay and the warm presence of animals created an atmosphere of simple comfort. Ezra Brennan led the horse into its stall with practiced ease, checking its water and feed with the automatic care of a man who understood that attention to small details was the foundation of larger success. "I live alone here," he said, as he secured the stall door. "The house is larger than one man needs, and there are tasks that would benefit from a woman's attention. The kitchen garden has been neglected, and the house itself could use the kind of care that makes a building into a home rather than merely a shelter." Adelaide felt a flutter of hope in her chest, quickly tempered by caution. What would such a position entail, and what terms would you offer? "Room and board, naturally. A private chamber in the house, with your own entrance, if you prefer. A fair wage that would allow you to save for your future or help support your family. In return, I would expect management of the household, cooking, cleaning, tending the vegetable garden, perhaps preserving food for winter." The offer was more generous than Adelaide had dared hope. "And the village? My employment here would certainly be the subject of much discussion." For the first time, Ezra Brennan's expression hardened slightly. "I pay little attention to village gossip, Miss Whitmore. My concern is with the running of this farm and the character of those who share my household." Adelaide felt a flash of her former spirit. "My reputation has already been thoroughly discussed by every tongue in Millbrook. What concerns me is not adding to that burden." He regarded her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Would you rather be the subject of gossip as a woman who accepted honest employment, or as one who remained dependent on others' charity while lamenting her circumstances?" The question struck Adelaide with the force of revelation. "When would you need an answer?" "When you're ready to give one," Ezra Brennan replied. "But understand that if you accept, I expect commitment. This is not a temporary refuge while you wait for your former circumstances to return. This would be a life, Miss Whitmore, with all the dignity that honest work provides." Adelaide looked around the barn, at the well-tended animals and tools maintained with obvious care, at the man who had built something substantial from land that others had abandoned. The fear that had driven her from the cottage that morning began to transform into something else. Not quite courage yet, but the foundation upon which courage might be built. "I accept," she said, the words emerging with a firmness that surprised her. "When would you like me to begin?" 3 weeks had passed since Adelaide Whitmore had walked through the gates of Oakwood Farm as a desperate woman seeking employment, and now she moved through the farmhouse with the quiet confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. The transformation had not been without its challenges. Her soft hands bore testimony to the reality of physical labor, and she had learned that managing a household was far more complex than she had ever imagined. The kitchen had become her domain, its large stone hearth and well-appointed pantry slowly yielding their secrets to her determined efforts. Under Ezra's patient guidance, she had learned to coax warmth and nourishment from ingredients that would have seemed foreign to her just a month before. The bread she now pulled from the oven bore little resemblance to her first attempts, which had emerged as dense, bitter loaves that even the farm dogs had regarded with suspicion. "The trick," Ezra had told her during one of her early failures, "is to treat the dough as you would a nervous horse, firm but gentle, consistent but not harsh." She had laughed at the comparison then, but as she kneaded the morning's batch of bread, Adelaide found herself understanding the wisdom in his words. Everything on Oakwood Farm seemed to operate on principles of patience and respect, for the land, for the animals, for the natural rhythms that governed rural life. The farmhouse itself had begun to reflect her presence in ways that surprised them both. Windows that had been functional but bare now framed views of the countryside, with simple curtains sewn from fabric purchased during her monthly trips to Millbrook. The kitchen garden, which had languished under Ezra's well-intentioned but inexpert care, now flourished with late autumn vegetables and herbs that would see them through the winter months. Adelaide paused in her bread-making to gaze through the kitchen window at the garden she had coaxed back to life. The neat rows of turnips, carrots and winter squash represented more than mere sustenance. They were proof of her ability to nurture something from seed to harvest, to contribute meaningfully to the life of the farm. The sound of hoofbeats on the gravel path drew her attention to the window where she could see Ezra returning from his morning rounds of the far pastures. His horse moved with easy grace, and Ezra himself sat in the saddle with the unconscious authority of a man born to such work, his weathered coat open to the crisp autumn air. Adelaide had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated his mood and energy level. This morning she could see the satisfaction in his posture that meant the cattle were thriving, the fences were sound, and the land was responding well to his careful stewardship. It was a contentment that seemed to radiate from him like warmth from the kitchen hearth. Their relationship had settled into a pattern that was both professional and oddly intimate. They were not equals in the traditional sense. She was his employee, dependent upon his goodwill for her livelihood. Yet there was a quality to their daily interactions that transcended the typical boundaries between employer and servant. Ezra sought her opinion on household matters, listened thoughtfully to her observations about the farm, and treated her suggestions with respect. "Miss Whitmore," he called as he approached the kitchen door, using the formal address they had maintained, despite the growing ease of their companionship. "I trust the morning has been productive?" "Indeed it has," Adelaide replied, wiping her hands on her apron and moving to open the door for him. "The bread will be ready shortly, and I've prepared a hearty stew for midday. The vegetables from our garden," she added with a note of pride. Ezra smiled, an expression that transformed his usually serious features, and reminded Adelaide that he was still a relatively young man, despite the responsibility and solitude that seemed to age him beyond his years. "Our garden," he repeated, and there was warmth in his voice that made Adelaide's heart skip. "I like the sound of that." "No, As he washed at the basin by the door, Adelaide busied herself with final preparations for their meal, trying not to notice the way his presence seemed to fill the kitchen with an energy that had nothing to do with the warmth from the stove. Their conversations during meals had become one of the unexpected pleasures of her new life. Unlike the artificial social exchanges that had characterized her previous existence, her talks with Ezra possessed a substance and honesty that nourished something deeper than mere politeness. He told her about his dreams for the farm, his plans for expanding the orchards and perhaps raising sheep. She shared her observations about the natural world around them, her growing understanding of the seasonal cycles that governed rural life. "I received a letter from my mother this morning," Adelaide said as they settled at the kitchen table with their meal. "She writes that the village continues to discuss my employment here." Ezra looked up from his stew, his grey eyes alert. "And what is the nature of this discussion?" Adelaide hesitated, not wanting to burden him with village gossip, yet needing to share the weight of what her new life had cost her. "There are those who believe my presence here is improper. An unmarried woman living in the household of an unmarried man provides abundant material for speculation." "I see," Ezra said quietly, setting down his spoon and giving her his full attention. "And how does this speculation affect you?" The question was asked with such gentle concern that Adelaide felt tears threaten behind her eyes. For weeks, she had maintained careful control over her emotions, determined to prove herself worthy of the opportunity Ezra had provided. "It affects me less than I expected," she admitted after a moment of reflection. "I find that I care more about your opinion than theirs, and more about the work we're accomplishing here than about maintaining a reputation among people who have already judged me harshly." Ezra nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "There's wisdom in that perspective. But I don't want your association with this farm to cause you additional hardship." "No," Adelaide interrupted, the word emerging with more force than she had intended. "I don't wish to leave. This place, this work, it's given me something I didn't know I was missing, a sense of purpose, of contribution, of belonging." The last word hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to examine. Adelaide busied herself with her meal, suddenly aware that she had revealed more than she intended, while Ezra studied her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "There's something I should tell you," he said finally, his voice carrying a gravity that made Adelaide look up from her plate. "The gossip about our arrangement has reached me as well. There are those who believe that your presence here compromises both our reputations." Adelaide felt familiar anxiety form in her stomach. "What do you propose we do about it?" "I propose we ignore it," Ezra said firmly. "But I also want you to understand that if you choose to remain at Oakwood Farm, there may come a time when we need to make our arrangement more conventional." Adelaide's heart began to beat faster as she tried to decipher the meaning behind his carefully chosen words. "Conventional in what way?" Ezra met her gaze directly, his grey eyes serious but not unkind. "There are only so many ways to silence gossip about an unmarried man and woman sharing a household, Miss Whitmore. Marriage is the most permanent and respectable solution." The word fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that seemed to reach every corner of the kitchen. Adelaide stared at him, trying to process what he was suggesting. "You're proposing marriage as a solution to village gossip?" she asked carefully. "I'm proposing marriage as a solution to several problems," Ezra replied, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of emotion that made Adelaide's breath catch. "The gossip, yes, but also the question of your security, your future, your place in the world. And perhaps the question of what has grown between us during these weeks of working together." Adelaide felt the room seem to tilt around her. She had been so focused on proving herself capable, on earning her place through hard work, that she had not allowed herself to acknowledge the deeper feelings that had been growing alongside her domestic skills. "What has grown between us?" she repeated softly, needing to hear him put words to the unnamed feelings that had been building like pressure behind a dam. Ezra rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the fields he had cultivated with such care. "Respect," he said finally. "Companionship. The kind of partnership that makes every day's work feel lighter because it's shared." He turned back to face her, his expression vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "And if I'm not mistaken, something deeper than either of those things." Adelaide rose as well, her legs unsteady as she processed the magnitude of what was happening. 3 weeks ago, she had been a fallen woman seeking employment to survive. Now she was being offered not just a job, but a life, a partnership, perhaps even love with a man who had seen her at her lowest point and still found her worthy of respect and care. "I need time to consider," she said, though her heart was already providing its answer with every rapid beat. "Of course," Ezra replied, moving back toward the door. "There's no urgency. But Adelaide—" He paused, using her given name for the first time since her arrival at the farm. "Whatever you decide, know that your place here is secure. If marriage is not what you want, you'll always have a home at Oakwood Farm for as long as you wish to stay." After he left to return to his afternoon work, Adelaide remained in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of the life she had built during her short time at the farm. The bread cooling on the windowsill, the herbs hanging in bundles from the rafters, the warm residue of shared conversation and careful companionship, all of it seemed to point toward a future she had never dared to imagine. Outside, she could see Ezra working in the barn, his movements efficient and purposeful as always. But now she saw him with new eyes, not just as her employer or even as a kind man who had offered her refuge, but as a potential partner in building something lasting and meaningful. As the afternoon sun slanted through the kitchen windows, Adelaide found herself imagining what that life might look like. Seasons turning over the same beloved land, growing old together in the house that had already begun to feel more like home than any mansion she had ever inhabited. The future stretched before her like the ploughed fields of Oakwood Farm, dark with potential and ready for whatever seeds she chose to plant. The following days at Oakwood Farm carried a different quality, as if the very air had become charged with possibility and uncertainty. Adelaide found herself acutely aware of every interaction with Ezra. Every shared glance and casual conversation now weighted with the knowledge of his proposal. He had given her space to consider, maintaining his usual respectful distance while continuing to treat her with the same consideration that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Yet there were moments when she caught him watching her with an expression that spoke of barely contained hope, quickly masked when their eyes met. She began to understand that his proposal had not been offered lightly, that beneath his patient exterior lay a man who had taken a significant risk in revealing his feelings. Adelaide's nights became restless affairs, filled with dreams that alternated between visions of contentment at Oakwood Farm and nightmares of returning to the suffocating pity of Millbrook society. She would wake before dawn, moving through the quiet house to begin her daily tasks, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of domestic work, while her heart wrestled with the magnitude of the decision before her. On the 4th morning after Ezra's proposal, Adelaide was tending to the kitchen garden when she heard the sound of an approaching carriage on the main road. Visitors were rare at Oakwood Farm, and she straightened with curiosity, shading her eyes against the morning sun, to see who might be traveling the isolated country lane. Her heart sank as she recognized the elegant black carriage that had once been as familiar as her own reflection. The Blackwood family crest gleamed on the door panels, and through the window she could see the unmistakable profile of Harold Blackwood himself, accompanied by his father, Magistrate Blackwood. Adelaide's first instinct was to flee to the house, to avoid a confrontation that could only bring pain and embarrassment. But as the carriage turned into the farm's entrance, she found herself rooted in place by a combination of curiosity and a newfound strength that refused to let her cower before the man who had abandoned her in her hour of greatest need. The carriage drew to a halt near the farmhouse, and Harold emerged with the careful grace that had once charmed her, but now seemed artificial and rehearsed. He was dressed in the height of fashion, his fine clothes and polished boots marking him as a visitor from a different world than the one Adelaide now inhabited. Behind him, Magistrate Blackwood descended with the ponderous dignity of a man accustomed to being treated with deference. "Adelaide," Harold called, his voice carrying across the garden with false warmth. "How rustic you look. Country life seems to agree with you." Adelaide became acutely aware of her appearance. Her simple dress, protected by a well-worn apron, her hands bearing the honest stains of garden soil, her hair pinned back practically rather than arranged for beauty. A month ago, such awareness would have filled her with shame. Now she found herself standing straighter, proud of the evidence of her useful labor. "Harold," she replied evenly, making no move to approach the carriage. "This is unexpected. What brings you to Oakwood Farm?" Before Adelaide could respond further, she heard familiar footsteps on the gravel path behind her. Ezra approached with his steady, unhurried gait, but Adelaide could sense the tension in his bearing as he assessed the visitors and their obvious intent. "Gentlemen," Ezra said, his voice carrying quiet authority, "I'm Ezra Brennan, owner of this property. Is there something I can help you with?" Harold's eyes moved between Adelaide and Ezra with obvious calculation, taking in their proximity and the domestic scene that surrounded them. "Mr. Brennan," he said, inclining his head with minimal courtesy, "I am Harold Blackwood, and this is my father, Magistrate Blackwood. We've come to speak with Miss Whitmore about a private matter." "Anything you wish to say to Miss Whitmore can be said in my presence," Ezra replied firmly. "She is under my protection here." The phrase sent warmth through Adelaide's chest. "Under my protection." The words carried weight and dignity, transforming her position from that of a displaced charity case to someone worthy of defense. Magistrate Blackwood's expression darkened at what he clearly perceived as impertinence. "Mr. Brennan, this is a family matter that requires privacy." "I'm not family to the Blackwoods," Adelaide said, finding her voice and courage simultaneously. "Not anymore. Whatever you wish to say can be said before Mr. Brennan." Harold stepped forward, his handsome features arranged in an expression of earnest appeal. "Adelaide, please. I know our parting was difficult, but circumstances have changed, and I've come to make things right between us." Adelaide felt a chill of premonition. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Harold said, reaching into his coat to withdraw an elegant envelope, "that I've spoken with my father, and we've agreed that our engagement should be restored. The bans can be republished, and we can proceed with the wedding as originally planned." The words fell into the autumn air like stones into still water. Adelaide stared at the envelope in Harold's hand, recognizing it as the same type of formal correspondence that had once announced their engagement to society. The audacity of the assumption that she would be grateful for this opportunity to return to a life that had been snatched away from her left her momentarily speechless. "You assume much, Mr. Blackwood," Ezra said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Perhaps you should wait for Miss Whitmore's response before making such pronouncements." Harold's eyes flashed with irritation, but he maintained his conciliatory tone. "Adelaide, I understand that you might need time to adjust to this wonderful news. I know you must have felt abandoned, and I sincerely regret that necessity forced such a temporary separation. But surely you must see that this is for the best. You can return to your proper place in society, leave behind this temporary interlude, and take up the life that was always meant to be yours." Adelaide found herself studying Harold's face, as if seeing it clearly for the first time. The features that had once seemed handsome now appeared weak. The charm that had once captivated her now revealed as shallow manipulation. "What has changed to make this renewed engagement possible?" she asked carefully. Magistrate Blackwood cleared his throat importantly. "We have received word that your family's debts are to be forgiven by the creditors. It seems there was an error in the accounting, and your father's assets were sufficient to cover his obligations. The Whitmore name is restored, and your dowry intact." Adelaide felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. If this were true, it meant her family's suffering had been unnecessary, their fall from grace, based on a mistake that could have been corrected months ago. "I see," she said slowly. "And when did you discover this error?" Harold shifted uncomfortably, and Adelaide caught the brief glance he exchanged with his father. "Recently. Very recently. The important thing is that justice has been done, and we can move forward as we always intended." But Adelaide had learned to read between lines during her weeks of careful observation at Oakwood Farm. She saw the evasion in Harold's manner, the calculation in his father's expression. "Why now?" she pressed. "What has prompted this sudden concern for accuracy in accounting?" It was Ezra who provided the answer, his voice cutting through the pretense with surgical precision. "Because the Whitmore property adjacent to the Blackwood estates has proven more valuable than originally assessed. The railway company has expressed interest in purchasing land for their new line, haven't they? Land that would be much easier to acquire if it were controlled by family members rather than creditors." The silence that followed was pregnant with exposure and truth. Adelaide saw Harold's face flush with embarrassment and anger, while his father's expression darkened with fury. "That is a serious accusation," Magistrate Blackwood said slowly, "and a dangerous one to make without proof." "I make no accusations," Ezra replied calmly. "I merely observe that the timing of this discovery seems remarkably convenient." Adelaide felt pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. The fire that had destroyed her father's mill had not been the disaster they believed. It had been an opportunity for the Blackwoods to acquire valuable property at a fraction of its worth. "Is this true?" she asked Harold directly, searching his face for any trace of the honor she had once believed him to possess. Harold's composure cracked slightly under her direct gaze. "Adelaide, you're allowing this man to poison your mind against me. What matters is that we can be together, as we always planned. You can leave behind this manual labor and return to the life of a gentlewoman." His disdain for the work that had given her such satisfaction crystallized Adelaide's understanding of the vast gulf that separated her current existence from the life he offered. She looked around the garden she had cultivated, at the farmhouse that had become more of a home than any mansion, at the man who had seen her worth when she was at her lowest point. "No," she said quietly, the word emerging with absolute certainty. Harold blinked in confusion. "I beg your pardon." "No," Adelaide repeated, her voice growing stronger. "I will not marry you, Harold. I will not return to a life built on deception and manipulation. I will not abandon work that gives me purpose for the empty pursuits of a society that discarded me the moment I became inconvenient." "Adelaide, you're not thinking clearly," Harold said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "You would choose the life of a servant over that of a magistrate's wife?" Adelaide stepped closer to Ezra, feeling his solid presence at her side like an anchor in a storm. "I choose the life of a partner," she said clearly. "I choose honest work over idle luxury. I choose a man who saw my worth when I had nothing to offer over one who abandoned me at the first sign of difficulty." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, and Adelaide saw Harold's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally cold fury. "You're making a terrible mistake," he said through gritted teeth. "When the novelty of this rural experiment wears off, you'll find yourself trapped in a life of drudgery with no way back to respectability." "Then it will be my mistake to make," Adelaide replied firmly, "and my life to live as I choose." As the Blackwood carriage pulled away, leaving behind only settling dust, Adelaide stood in the garden she had planted with her own hands, beside the man who had offered her not just employment, but partnership. She felt the weight of her choice settle around her like a warm cloak. "No doubts?" Ezra asked quietly, his eyes searching her face. Adelaide turned to face him fully, seeing in his weathered features and storm-grey eyes a future built on truth and mutual respect. None, she said, and meant it with every fibre of her being. The week following Harold's departure passed in a blur of purposeful activity, as if Adelaide's decisive rejection of her former life had released an energy that demanded physical expression. She threw herself into the final preparations for winter with an intensity that both impressed and concerned Ezra, who watched her work with the careful attention of a man who understood that significant decisions often required time to settle into the heart. The kitchen garden yielded its last treasures under Adelaide's careful harvest. Root vegetables that would sustain them through the cold months, herbs bundled and dried for seasoning and medicine, late apples gathered from the orchard trees. Each preserved jar that lined the pantry shelves represented security earned through honest labor, a tangible reminder of the life Adelaide had chosen over the hollow promises of restored social position. On a crisp morning when frost painted delicate patterns on the windows, Adelaide found herself standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the main hallway, suddenly aware that she was poised on the threshold of something far more significant than the simple passage between rooms. "Adelaide," Ezra's voice called from the front parlour, and she could hear an unusual note of formality that made her pulse quicken. "Would you join me, please?" She found him standing beside the window that overlooked the main road, dressed not in his usual work clothes, but in the dark suit he reserved for trips to town and special occasions. In his hands he held a small wooden box, polished smooth by age and handling, its simple beauty speaking of careful craftsmanship and meaningful purpose. "I've been thinking," he began, then paused as if gathering courage for words that would reshape their future, "about your answer to my proposal, about the choice you made when Harold came calling, about what it means for both of us moving forward." Adelaide's heart began to beat with the rhythm of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. "And what conclusions have you reached?" Ezra turned from the window to face her directly, his grey eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the rest of the world seem to fade away. "That if you're willing to burn bridges to stay at Oakwood Farm, perhaps it's time I offered you something more substantial than employment and protection." He opened the wooden box to reveal a ring unlike any Adelaide had ever seen. It was not the elaborate confection of diamonds and gold that Harold had presented during their engagement, but a simple band of rose gold set with a single sapphire, the color of deep twilight, surrounded by small diamonds that caught the morning light like dewdrops on spider silk. "This belonged to my grandmother," Ezra said, his voice soft with memory and emotion. "She married my grandfather when they had nothing but determination and a shared dream of building something lasting. They carved a farm from wilderness, raised 6 children, and remained devoted to each other through 50 years of joy and hardship." Anne Adelaide stared at the ring, understanding that she was being offered not just a piece of jewelry, but a legacy, a connection to a tradition of partnerships built on mutual respect and enduring love. "Adelaide Whitmore," Ezra continued, dropping to one knee with natural grace, "will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not as a solution to gossip or social convention, but as my true partner in building a life worthy of the love that has grown between us." The formal proposal, offered in the parlor of the house that had become her sanctuary, struck Adelaide as profoundly different from Harold's elaborate courtship rituals. There were no witnesses to impress, no social advantages to be gained, no family alliances to be cemented. There was only a man who had seen her at her worst and chosen to offer his best. "Yes," she whispered, the word emerging with such quiet certainty that it seemed to have been waiting in her heart for this exact moment. "Yes, Ezra Brennan, I will marry you." He rose to slip the ring onto her finger, and Adelaide was struck by how perfectly it fit, as if it had been waiting for her hand all along. The sapphire caught the light from the window, sending small rainbows dancing across the parlor walls. "When?" she asked, suddenly practical in the way that weeks of managing a household had taught her to be. "As soon as you wish," Ezra replied, his relief and joy evident in the smile that transformed his features. Though I thought perhaps we might wait until spring, Adelaide looked around the parlour that would soon officially become hers, at the man who had already become essential to her happiness, at the ring that symbolized a future built on honest labor and genuine affection. "I don't need time to be certain," she said firmly. "I've had weeks to observe what kind of man you are, what kind of life we could build together. Why should we delay when our minds are made up and our hearts are sure?" Their wedding, held on a brilliant December morning when the ground sparkled with fresh snow and the air carried the clean scent of winter, was everything Adelaide's first engagement ceremony would not have been. Instead of an elaborate social event designed to impress the county's most prominent families, it was an intimate gathering of those who truly mattered to their daily lives. Mrs. Abernathy attended, bringing a jar of her finest honey as a wedding gift, and offering Adelaide a warm embrace that spoke of genuine affection rather than social obligation. Several of Ezra's neighbouring farmers came with their wives, solid people who had accepted Adelaide based on her character rather than her pedigree. Even her parents managed to attend, her father looking healthier than he had in months, and her mother finally beginning to understand that her daughter had found something more valuable than social status. The ceremony itself was conducted by Reverend Fletcher, who had clearly struggled with his own preconceptions before deciding that true reformation deserved recognition and blessing. His words spoke of partnerships founded on mutual respect, of love that deepened through shared labor, of the sacred nature of commitments made freely between equals. Adelaide wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her new figure, which had grown strong and capable through months of physical work. The simple sapphire ring was joined by a matching band of rose gold, and she carried a bouquet of winter greenery and holly berries gathered from the grounds of Oakwood Farm. When Reverend Fletcher pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra's kiss was gentle but thorough, sealing a promise that had been building between them since her first desperate morning at his farm. The small congregation erupted in applause and well-wishes, but Adelaide heard only the beating of her own heart and the whispered words of her new husband. "Welcome home, Mrs. Brennan." The celebration continued at the farm, where Adelaide had prepared a feast that showcased everything she had learned about cooking and hospitality. The house filled with laughter and conversation, neighbors sharing stories and advice, children running between the rooms with boundless energy. As evening fell and the guests departed into the crisp winter night, Adelaide found herself standing once again in the kitchen doorway. But now everything had changed. She was no longer an employee or a guest, but the mistress of Oakwood Farm, partner to the man who had built it, and equal participant in whatever future they would create together. Ezra approached from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing his question from weeks before. Adelaide leaned back against his solid warmth, watching through the window as snow began to fall over the fields they would work together, the garden they would tend, the home they would fill with the fruits of their labor and love. "None," she said, and the word carried the weight of absolute truth. "This is exactly where I belong." Outside, the snow fell steadily, blanketing Oakwood Farm in pristine white that would nourish the soil for spring planting. Inside, husband and wife stood together in the kitchen, where their partnership had begun, surrounded by the evidence of their shared work and the promise of seasons yet to come. Adelaide Brennan had traded a hollow crown for an honest plough, empty social triumph for meaningful daily victory, the admiration of those who valued appearance over the love of one who cherished her true self. In the end, she had discovered that the greatest fortune was not counted in pounds sterling or social position, but in the depth of connection possible when two hearts chose to build something lasting together. The farmhouse settled into winter quiet around them, secure and warm against the storm, while Adelaide and Ezra began their first evening as husband and wife, partners in all the adventures that lay ahead. Through the window, the snow continued to fall over Oakwood Farm, and Adelaide knew with absolute certainty that she had found her way home at last.